Where shall we three meet again, in thunder, lightning, or rain? When the hurly-burly's done, when the battle's lost and won, which shall be ere the set of sun, where the place upon the heath, there to meet with Macbeth. I come, Grey Malcolm, Paddock calls, anon. Fair is foul and foul is fair, over through the mist and filthy air. Keep your hatred off our campus, keep your hatred off our campus, keep your hatred off our campus, keep your hatred off our campus. Hello, hello, hello. Today I would like to talk about something which has been interesting me for quite a long time, and it's an idea that was suggested to me by a viewer of mine in the wake of that poor chap Adam Ngo being beaten up by members of Antifa. The viewer in question saw pictures of the woman who was one of those who was arrested for beating him up and noticed and said something along the lines of, "Can't we start burning witches again?" Her argument being that the woman was extremely physically unattractive, as we've seen in other videos. SJWs tend to be extremely physically unattractive, and that the woman was basically satanic and deviant and was therefore a witch. And it got me thinking. We think of witches when we're children from fairy tales, a woman on a broomstick with a cat wearing black and a pointed kind of Welsh hat. And there's something of the past, and we stopped executing witches in England in the early 1700s or whenever it was. There's something of the long ago. They're no longer relevant to us now. But perhaps they are. Perhaps we are actually seeing a rise of witches, of witchcraft. Perhaps part of what's happening to our society, part of the problem, is there are simply too many witches. In the old days, witches were gotten rid of, but now witches are everywhere. Witches are taking over my life, taking over your life, taking over all our lives, because most female SJWs would have been regarded, had they lived 400 years ago in England or most of Europe, as being witches. And so let's have a look at this idea. And so first of all, what were witches? There was a witch craze. It's very, very interesting. There was a witch craze in Europe between about 1550 and 1700. There was this craze in which thousands of women were burned at the stake for witchcraft. Now, what was the nature of these witches? Stereotypically, they were, according to David Pickering in his Dictionary of Witchcraft, they were haggard old women living in a rotten little cottage. They were elderly, ignorant women. They had odd ways and behaviour. They tended to be regarded as physically ugly. Witch hunters were more likely to try to prosecute somebody who had a squint, who had a monobrow, who was physically unattractive, who had warts and scars. Indeed, they looked for evidence of sort of mutations, really, a third nipple, things like this. These were understood to be the devil's mark, and they were understood to suckle devils on a third teat, this sort of thing. So basically, they were physically unattractive, old, particularly physically unattractive, and sort of antisocial and strange and unusual in the context of the time, of the religious time, old women. They were also very much women. Between 1566 and 1666, according to Pickering, 90% of people who were executed in England for witchcraft were women. 85% of these women were over the age of 50. 40% of these female witches were widows, and about 50% were never married, i.e. were spinsters. And this is interesting because it's in a context in which there were more females than males. Males tended to die younger, boys would be killed in accidents and things like this, and so there was an excess of females in this highly patriarchal society, and these were basically the females that nobody wanted. The women that ended up being unmarried, or indeed didn't want to marry, were widowed and didn't remarry. Now, there was also some evidence of a genetic element to these witches. We've seen in other videos that personality is strongly genetic, and there was a genetic element to it. If you were the daughter of a convicted witch, you were far more likely to be accused of witchcraft yourself. Now, what was going on with these witches? Why were they a problem? Well, it strikes me as fairly obvious from the information that we've got, from the summary of the research that we've got, that these were people who were high in mutational load. Now, these were societies that were under harsh Darwinian selection, in which every generation 40% of children would die, people would not reach adulthood. They were under harsh Darwinian selection. But even so, I mean, there were places where the Darwinian selection could have been harsher than it was. And so consequently, of course, there would be some people that were, as it were, more mutated. And this would be evidenced, of course, as we've discussed before, in what they looked like. People who are high mutational load will tend to be physically unattractive. They will tend to have asymmetrical faces. They will tend to have things wrong with them, such as a monobrow or a squint or whatever. They will tend to have things wrong with them. They will be unable to maintain a symmetrical phenotype in the face of the diseases that life throws at them, because they will have a poor immune system, lots of mutant genes, meaning that they have to employ proportionately more of their energy in fighting off disease. And we've discussed in other videos that because the brain is about 88% of the genome, physical abnormalities tend to correlate with mental abnormalities. And we've seen that people who are irreligious, by proxy, but the proxy being how right-wing they are, people who are religious, the proxy being how right-wing they are, have more symmetrical faces than people who are irreligious. And this makes sense because we would have been clearly selected to be religious, because religiousness is 40% genetic, and religiousness is associated with fertility, and it's associated with high agreeableness and conscientiousness, which would have been selected for under Darwinian conditions, and it's associated with good health and longevity and so on. And so what we can then start to say about these witches is that what they were mutants. They were the mutants of their time. They were these people who were high in mutational load, making them physically unattractive and also mentally unattractive, and therefore peculiar in their behaviour and antisocial in their behaviour and so on, and likely to advocate maladaptive ideas. Spiteful mutants, likely to advocate ideas which would undermine the adaptiveness of the group of which they were a part. And perhaps for this reason they tended to be shunned, they tended to live on the borders of the community, this sort of thing. And in times of great stress, which was the case in the 17th century, and this is why the witch craze was so severe perhaps in the 17th century, because it was a time of great famine and overpopulation and stress. People would be less tolerant of them and more prone to persecute them. Now, this is very interesting in terms of the development of the system at the time. We have at that time a highly patriarchal system, and it can be argued that they, by virtue of being female and single, by virtue of being female and going and living with other females, which is what it seems there's some evidence that some of them did do that, by virtue of not wanting to remarry, these antis, and by virtue simply of being antisocial and not cooperating and not doing the things you're supposed to do, they were challenging this patriarchal system, and indeed this system of religiousness that was in place. Now, this system was undoubtedly important because, as we have seen in other videos, religiousness essentially takes things which are highly adaptive in evolutionary terms and turns them into the will of God. So the religious perspective that was operative in England and the rest of Europe at that time was essentially something which was highly adaptive, which was taking things which were adaptive forms of behaviour and making those the will of God, thus making them even more likely to be followed. Now, one of these was the patriarchal system. Why was the patriarchal system adaptive? Well, it meant that women were guarded because in societies where they were open to little law and order, the little police force, anything like that, no security cameras, men wanted to be sure that their investment in their offspring paid off, because this encourages them to invest in their offspring and helps to create a more cooperative society. Women therefore had to be guarded. This is the nature of patriarchy, guarded and controlled. But there's a degree to and not independent and under the rule of men. so that men were not jealous of each other, so that men were not fighting, so that men were not concerned about being cuckolded, so they could cooperate with each other. And if they could cooperate with each other, then then they would be more likely to make sacrifices for the community, more likely to cooperate with each other in battle, more likely to be, as it were, high in positive ethnocentrism. And equally, if they could cooperate with each other and create a strong sense of community and loyalty and all this, then they would have a stronger sense of difference between themselves and another group, and therefore they would be high in negative ethnocentrism. And as we have seen, computer models indicate that the groups which survive under conditions of harsh selection tend to be the groups that are higher in positive and negative ethnocentrism. And that's what religiousness does. It elevates positive and negative ethnocentrism. It essentially makes the organisation more group selected and thus more likely to survive, all else being equal, under conditions of harsh Darwinian selection in the battle of group selection. So that's what the religion is doing. That's what the religion of the time is doing, and that's what and part of that religion is patriarchy, which reassures men about paternity anxiety and ensures that they are more able to cooperate and thus make sacrifices for the good of the group and all this and invest in the group and invest in and trust each other and so on. So this is what these witches are undermining, and they are undermining this by demonstrating that there may be problems with the patriarchy, that the patriarchy might not be written in stone, because these women are able to be independent. These women are able to go around, are able to live alone without male control. These women are able to, even though the Bible and the religion and so on is indicating that women should be controlled by men, these women are independent of men, and so these women are evidently a problem, and then of course that had always been the case. I mean, you could argue that this was the case in the early medieval period as much as it was in the 17th century. But the thing is that we weren't as groups selected in the medieval period as we were in the 17th century. As I have demonstrated in a study with Guy Madison on execution, we were under these conditions of harsh group selection and of group selection across the period, and consistent with this, we were becoming more religious, and we demonstrate this in our paper in a study that we did. We became more religious between the early medieval period and the 16th century, and the reason for this is that there were a number of selection of events, factors which indirectly selected for religiousness. The first of them that we were executing about 2% of young men every generation. These young men would have been men who were low in conscientiousness and low in agreeableness, because this predicts criminality. And those traits that predict criminality are negatively associated with religiousness. So this would have elevated religiousness. Secondly, it's quite clear that the Black Death would have elevated general factor of personality, i.e. high conscientiousness, and because these kinds of people would have been better able to make plans and better able to get away from the plague-ridden areas and so on. And this would therefore have promoted religiousness. Thirdly, socioeconomic status is associated with these personality traits. Socioeconomic status massively predicted surviving the Black Death, and so this would have elevated religiousness as well. And as evidenced by the percentage of the population prepared to involve themselves in religious houses across the period, which went up and up and up, we were becoming more religious. We were becoming more group selected. And if we were becoming more religious, it would follow that we would be more concerned about things like devils, more concerned about things like witches. We would take witchcraft more seriously. And we see across the period that it moves from being something at the beginning of the medieval period that isn't even a criminal offence, to being something that is a criminal offence, to being something that carries the death penalty, in England of hanging, and that by the early 16th century it's a capital offence, only by then. And then it gets even worse as we become even more group selected, and it combines with this very cold period in which there's lots of famine and so on. Then it becomes a very bad thing indeed. By then we're extremely religious. Puritan influence in England and in Britain is extremely high, and then the witchcraft is punishable by being burned at the stake. And it is a very, very serious issue between under the period of the Long Parliament, for example, between the I think was it 1643 and 1645. Under that period alone, hundreds of women were burned at the stake just in those few years for witchcraft. The Witchfinder General, Matthew Hopkins. So there was this period of time in which there was this witch craze, and what they were doing, the problem with them was that they were undermining group selection. They were undermining group selection, A, because they were women and they were independent and so on. B, this meant that it would lead the patriarchy to possibly be questioned. C, this could potentially lead to the religiousness and the whole system that was holding society together being questioned. And also there's a degree to which we would expect them to have advocated unusual, strange ideas, irreligious ideas perhaps, or individualistic ideas, which would have been maladaptive, because these were, after all, malcontent, individualistic people. So from a group selection perspective, we can understand why people executed witches, and why they executed witches with particular fervour in this period of time when we were particularly strongly group selected, but also in which we were under intense Darwinian selection, and in which we hadn't yet had the benefits of the Industrial Revolution and greater urbanisation, which would make people more educated and reduce these kinds of fears and this sort of thing. And the witch craze only finally goes away around about the time of the Industrial Revolution, when it could be argued that because intelligence has been selected for over this time as well, we've become more and more intelligent, as we know from our book At Our Wits' End. Our levels of per capita genius go up and up and up, and levels of other proxies for intelligence go up and up and up. Eventually it seems that we have become too intelligent to really believe in things like witchcraft anymore. And by about 1700, belief in it, or a bit later, is fading away. And this coincides, of course, with the time in which the Industrial Revolution begins. So I would say that's a reasonable summary of what's going on with these witches. We are a highly group-selected society, and they are potentially making the society less group-selected, less adaptive, and therefore it becomes adaptive to kill them. And that is to burn them at the stake. And that is exactly what people in 16th and particularly 17th century England did. Now, as we've discussed before, with the collapse of Darwinian selection, you get the rise of the mutant. You get the rise of these people, these who would have died out under Darwinian conditions, and they're going to advocate that we would expect them to be physically dysmorphic, because this correlates with mutant genes of the mind, and they're going to advocate these spiteful maladaptive ideas such as multiculturalism and that kind of thing, which were not good for the extended genotype, and get into positions of power and influence to be maladaptive, just ordinarily cooperative people who are not the carriers. We've discussed this in other videos. So with the collapse of Darwinian selection, what you'd expect to see is that witches, the people who under pre-modern conditions would be understood to be witches, they will proliferate like anything. There will be the most unbelievable mushrooming in the percentage of the population who are witches. You will get more and more females who would have died out under harsh Darwinian conditions due to having a poor immune system. And those people will tend to be physically unattractive, as SJWs tend to be, and they will tend to advocate left-wing ideas, i.e. ideas which would be maladaptive under Darwinian conditions, such as multiculturalism, or maladaptive anyway, such as multiculturalism, which encourages you to look after other people's ethnic interests, genetic interests, not your own, or feminism, which basically helps women to avoid breeding. And other difficulties as well, such as that it drives society in a less rational direction because women are higher in empathy but lower in systematizing. These kinds of problems. You're going to get more and more of these women, and these women are going to be disinterested in marrying. They're going to be disinterested in having children. They're going to advocate these maladaptive ideas, and you're going to expect them, precisely because it's maladaptive, to rise up into positions of influence, to rise up into academia, and to then use that position to influence the whole society to be more maladaptive. More and more witches. More and more people who, under pre-modern conditions, would have been understood to be witches. And as they get older, their maladaptiveness will be more germane, more relevant as they get, as it were, over the age of 50, because then they really will come into positions of power. And then they really, as they move up the hierarchy, and then they really will be able to influence society in a maladaptive direction from their position as professor of gender studies and a TV pundit or whatever. And you'd expect these people, like the witches of yore, to be low in aspects of general factor of personality, to be aggressive, to be mentally unstable, things like this, because these would be associated with mutation, and these would be the kind of things that would have been selected out under conditions of Darwinian selection. You'd expect them to have eating disorders. You'd expect them to have terrible tempers. You'd expect them to have all kinds of things wrong with them. And so it seems to me that this viewer of mine made a very good point. What we are seeing now in Europe is not, and the West, is not just the rise of the mutant. That's true. We've established that in other videos, but very specifically the rise of the witch. Because what the witch was a female who was high in mutational load, and because she was high in mutational load, she was physically unattractive. She was unattractive in terms of her personality. She was uninterested in men and in getting married and having children and things like this. And to a certain degree, she advocated ideas which were opposed, which questioned in some way the established religiousness, which was itself highly group selected. She behaved in antisocial and problematic ways which would have negatively influenced the behaviour of the rest of the group. She helped to undermine group selection and the adaptedness of the group. Darwinian selection collapses, you're going to get a huge rise in people exactly like this, in females who undermine group selection by advocating, by being generally antisocial and unpleasant, and by advocating maladaptive ideas such as multiculturalism and so on. And those same women are, of course, not going to be interested in having children or getting married. So we see the rise of the witch. So those of us who are conservative, those of us who would have survived under conditions of Darwinian selection, we should be aware of this, I think. Witches are not something from days of yore or whatever, that from fairy tales, from children's books, Meg and Mog. Witches are very real. They are here with us now. They are very, very strongly represented in humanities departments and social science departments at universities. And they are helping to undermine our own group selection, our own inclination to look after our genetic interests, our own inclination as a people, as an ethnic group, or just as humanity as a whole, if they advocate things like extreme environmentalism, to survive. So we should not forget the fact when we're dealing with these leftists, these female leftists, that what we are dealing with is people who a few hundred years ago would have been on trial for witchcraft. And as I've said, you can probably tell if they're witches by virtue of them being physically unattractive, them being over 50 and unmarried and childless, and them advocating maladaptive ideas, and them being generally quite unpleasant people. But if you're not 100% sure, I'm told the way you can work it out is to weigh them. Because if they weigh the same as a duck, then they're made of wood. And therefore, they're a witch! Okay, well, I hope this has been of interest, and I'd like to thank the person who inspired me to make this video. This is actually going to be part of a book, this issue of Witchcraft and the Rise of the Witch that I'm writing at the moment, called The Taming of the Gene. And if you would like to help me to fund this new book, then I would be very, very happy if you could do so. It would be most kind of you if you could give me a little bit, a few guineas, or cast a few spells in the direction of Subscribestar, PayPal, or Patreon. And I'd like to thank very, very much those who over the last week who have subscribed, who have done it. And please subscribe to the channel. It really helps if you do that. Please subscribe and spread the word. And if you have any ideas for videos, then for goodness sake get in touch, because I'm always open to new ideas. And goodbye.